Safe, reliable, free, and honest support. Qualities you cannot find online. Until now. Introducing the next generation of online technology support. What technology malfunctions are troubling you? Let us know today on the all-new support forums at www.theapplepost.com.
Welcome to GeekCross, a podcast where faith and culture intersect. I'm your host, Jeremy Yoder. Each episode, we look at a topic related to pop culture or geekdom and have conversations that use science fiction, fantasy movies, gaming, or comic books as a jumping-off point to talk about deeper issues and to wrestle with the big questions of life. My guest on this episode is Kevin Kakazu.
Hi, Jeremy.
Kevin, why don't you say a couple words about who you are and what you do?
All right. I am currently, my major function here is in life right now is that of a full-time stay-at-home dad. I have a son who will be 2 years old in just a couple of weeks here, and I take care of him during the day while my wife goes to work. I have a couple of part-time jobs, though. I teach in the religion department at La Sierra University in Riverside, California. And I'm also the Children's Ministries Director at our local church here in California.
And which denomination are you with?
I'm with the Seventh Day Adventist Church.
Well, I do have to congratulate you. You are the officially first minister other than myself on GeekCross.
Oh, wow.
I've had 3 lawyers and no other pastor, so congratulations.
Well, I'll try and make this a good experience here. Yeah.
You are also have one other claim to fame, I believe. You are the originator of the term shooty stabby. Isn't that correct?
That is correct. A few months ago, the good folks at Unconsolable were asking for a new term for hardcore games. The games like, I guess, Call of Duty and the like, Halo and those kinds of things. And on a whim, I sort of responded to them, and I put out this term that I thought, there's no way they're going to accept this. They're going to think this is ridiculous. But I guess they liked it, and so that's been going around a bit now.
Yeah, it's kind of taken off a little bit. It has a kind of a life of its own, just a little bit. We'll see if we can get it into the general, lexicon. But I think it's a great term. I think it sort of kind of describes things pretty well. So, you're with the Seventh Day Adventist. Why don't you say a couple words about who they are, and they have some distinct beliefs. When I first came out here and was part of the local ministerial association, some of the pastors got a call because the person who was calling them felt that the SDA pastor in our association was not a real Christian. Mm-hmm. So, who are the SDA? Why are they viewed with suspicion?
All right, I guess the Adventist Church was started in or around 1844. That's when the church sort of started. It didn't actually become an organized denomination until some 20 years later. But in 1844, there was an event known as the Great Disappointment. At least that's what it's called in Adventist circles. I don't know if it has such an awesome-sounding name in other denominations, but that's what we called it. We called it the Great Disappointment because Adventists came originally from a group called the Millerites. A man named William Miller had been studying the Bible and thought that he had pinpointed the exact date of Christ's return. After a few attempts, he narrowed it down to October 22, 1844. And of course, that didn't happen. Christ did not come. And so there were a bunch of these people who were awaiting that, and it was just a devastating experience for them. And a few of those people joined together. They were searching for what went wrong, and that sort of became the seed for what became known as the Seventh Day Adventist Church. Today, I think as of about 2013, there are about 18 million Seventh Day Adventists worldwide. I just heard in our church service a couple of weeks ago, we had the big general conference meeting. That's a worldwide meeting of all Seventh-day Adventists. And I guess they said at that meeting that Adventists are now the 5th largest international Christian denomination. That's like a denomination that has not been limited to the country or the region where it started.
Wow, I mean, there are only 1.5 million Mennonites in the world.
Oh, wow.
So you're quite larger than us.
Yeah, but I guess if you just count the people who are in North America, the denomination was started here in the United States, actually, up in the northeastern part of the U.S. I think the membership here is maybe under 1 million. It's either just under or just over 1 million. So most of the membership is actually out in the greater world church.
It's in the global South, right? I mean, Latin America, Southeast Asia, and Africa.
That's right.
That's kind of the typical story now. I mean, that's really where the growth of the church is right now.
Yep.
Same with the Mennonites. That's where the majority of
really?
them are. The largest Mennonite denomination in the world is in Ethiopia.
Oh, wow. All right.
Yeah, and it's interesting. They began back in the 50s with missionaries that came over from the United States.
Okay.
And so what ended up happening in the 80s, there was a Marxist government that took over, and the church went underground. I'm sure you may remember about, there was that big famine in Ethiopia in the 80s. That's around that time. So they went underground. And when the Marxist government was overthrown back in the mid-90s, they came out and they discovered that the church had grown underground.
Wow.
It was much larger than anybody had expected.
Yeah.
It continues to grow and grow and grow. And a couple of years ago, they outgrew my denomination here in the United States. What distinct beliefs do the SDA have other than this rather colorful beginning?
Well, right there in the name, you have two of the major pillars, I guess, of belief. The first part, Seventh Day Adventist worship on the seventh day. We call it the Sabbath, so we go to church and do all of our worship functions on Saturday. So that, of course, puts us, makes us different than the vast majority of Christianity. And then the second part of the name, Adventists, the church still maintains a very strong belief and emphasis in the second coming of Christ. The official church, they say, Jesus is returning soon. I'd like to think that we have learned from that experience in 1844, and we are not putting dates, setting dates for the exact time. But unfortunately, that is not the case. There are some very radical, often offshoot preachers who will come along. It seems like they come along about every 5 or 10 years. It might be now more often, thanks to YouTube and the internet and the like. But, these people will come up and they'll say, well, Jesus is coming in 2 years, or it'll be coming in September or something like that. And I just kind of, guess we just haven't learned yet. So, So yeah, those are the two things that are right there in the name. The other, I guess, major distinctive is in a doctrine called the investigative judgment in the heavenly sanctuary. And I won't really try and get into that unless you'd like me to. It's a very long and drawn-out and complicated process.
Briefly here, yes.
Okay, briefly. Basically, the idea is that some early Adventists, they did some Bible study in the Old Testament, in like Leviticus and Numbers, looking at the description of the earthly sanctuary there. God, was telling the Israelites, set up the sanctuary, build this thing in this certain way. And some of these founding members of the Adventist Church, they looked at that and they said that there is not only this earthly sanctuary that God set up, but there's also a sanctuary in heaven, and it corresponds to that description that God gave to the Israelites. Along with that is the idea that Jesus is up in heaven right now, and he's sort of doing ministry along that same sort of pattern. He is like our high priest, ministering in the most holy place, and, just sort of waiting now to come back to earth, and we're waiting for that. Weaved into that is a lot of prophecy, a lot of these, important dates that have come up, and it all leads up, of course, to 1844, sort of calling out this new group of people to announce the soon coming of Jesus.
So one of the things that I said just in my intro here is that the Seventh Day Adventists are not always understood to be Christians by other Christians.
Yes.
Is that your experience?
As far as my experience goes, it hasn't been. I grew up mainly on the west coast of the U.S. here, and this area is known for producing the most sort of liberal and worldly Adventists. There's a term in the Adventist church for people, especially who grow up in California, and that's Badventists. And that's Adventists, who don't really take, all of these things very seriously or rigorously. A lot of people out here will, be eating meat, and that's something that a lot of Adventists don't do.
You're vegetarians, is that correct?
I think the official sort of ideal for the church is, I don't think that is an actual doctrine. There's an overall idea of this health message, and vegetarianism kind of goes into that. But especially out here, there are a lot of Adventists who don't exactly hold to that. I personally, I just ate a double cheeseburger from Carl's Jr. for lunch today. So,
well, there goes that.
Yeah. I certainly have heard, in other parts of the U.S., in some smaller churches, there are some people who hold, maybe to more historical types of beliefs. And I do know for a fact that sort of before the 1950s or so, Adventism was viewed as, this non-Christian cult by most evangelicals and Protestants. Since the 1950s, that sort of has changed. The church began conversation with the greater evangelical community, and they answered a bunch of questions to the satisfaction of a lot of evangelicals. But I would not be surprised at all if in certain places those ideas still persisted.
Okay. Now, before we move on, one final question about the distinctives of the SDA.
Okay.
One of your early leaders was woman, right?
That's right. Yeah, one of the influential early Seventh-day Adventists was a woman named Ellen White. She was born, I believe, around 1827 and lived until 1915. Around 1844 onwards, she began to experience some unusual things. She reported having visions, and she started writing these things down. And her writings really proved to be sort of galvanizing for this early group. It was just kind of this ragtag group of people who had left their own churches to join this Millerite movement and wait for Jesus to come again. And if it hadn't been for Ellen White, her reports of visions and her writings, this community probably would have just disintegrated. There were a lot of other Adventist movements around this time, but they just kind of all disappeared. And one of the most translated authors, I believe, in the entire world, she wrote a whole bunch of books. I don't even know how many books she wrote. A lot more articles for church publications, private letters. She has this big, huge Ellen White estate that sort of controls all of her writings and things. And yeah, so she became considered to be a prophet in the church, and her writings became very important for the thinking and sort of formation of the beliefs of the church.
And so it's been really interesting as an outsider watching, your convention that you just had, your large worldwide meeting, is that, voting on whether or not to ordain women when, you have a woman that's such a prominent part of your history.
Yeah. Yeah, that is something that has been sort of an embarrassment to a lot of us, who are very active in advocating for women being ministers and women being, fully recognized as leaders in this church, and just pointing to her and saying, "Come on, how can we not have women being pastors when we called this woman a prophet and she was so important?" The church wouldn't even be around if not for her, in all likelihood. But yeah, that's a source of frustration. People had all sorts of ways that they made sense of that distinction. They said she was a prophet, not a pastor. They're distinct offices. God can call prophets, but only men can be pastors. And it was super frustrating. And yeah, I got tired of arguing with people online. But
yeah, it sounds a bit like what I've been going through with the Mennonites and gays and lesbians, and I've talked a little bit about my frustrations here. Let's talk a little bit about your experience as a geek. You and I have had incredibly geeky late night conversations.
Yes.
Talk a little bit about that experience and a little bit how does your sort of geekiness fit in with your faith?
My experience as a geek, it started when I was very young, watching cartoons. Like we talked about, I mentioned there was this cartoon called Star Blazers, translated into English from the original anime called Space Battleship Yamato. This was in Japan in the late 70s, and it came over to the U.S. When I was just a really little kid in the early 80s. that sort of introduced me to this idea that, cartoons could be these lengthy, epic narratives. This, I think, spanned a couple of seasons, and it was this massive, tale of like a big trek through the stars. And it was that show, another few Japanese cartoons that came over to the U.S., one called Transor Z, about this giant robot that protected the world, and also Robotech was a major one.
That was pretty popular when we were kids. I kind of remember Robotech on Saturday morning.
Yeah, that was, really important. Of course, you mentioned it was on Saturday morning, so I never got to really watch it. My cousins had a VCR. Right. They would tape it, and we'd go over there and, do this big marathon and stuff. But yeah, that sort of got me started in this sort of, geeky world of giant robots and aliens and traversing the stars and those sorts of things. I really got into video games. Early 80s, the Atari 2600, Pac-Man, Missile Command, Space Invaders, and that carried on into sort of the Nintendo era, with Super Mario Brothers and Contra and these sorts of games. And that, is kind of where I'm at right now. I've continued being interested in video games, and that's kind of my experience with geekiness.
Now, in the last episode that I did, I recorded with Steve Lubitz, and we talked about representation and of Jews in geek culture.
Mm-hmm.
You're, of course, from a Japanese background.
Yes.
Is that one of the issues that you're concerned about how Japanese are depicted? I mean, there's this weird thing that anime and manga comes from Japan. Are there some representation issues there as well?
I guess there is in a certain way. I mean, geek culture, sort of reveres Japan for that reason. A lot of the source material has come from Japan. Dragon Ball and Pokemon and some of these earlier cartoons and programs that I talked about. But then along with that, there comes this sort of negative idea as well that all Japanese people are like what you see in these cartoons, and the guys are just these sort of silent, stoic, emotionally crippled people, and the women and girls are just, kind of flighty and cute, and that sort of idea, it tends to not be entirely positive. And so that's a thing that I've had to deal with growing up. I was born in Hawaii. We moved here to Southern California, and there's lots of Japanese and lots of Asian people here. But then the year before I started high school, we moved up to Eastern Washington, and pretty much everybody there was white. In my high school, there were a couple of black families, there were a couple of Asian families, but, pretty much everybody was white up there. And, yeah, I got all sorts of fun stereotyping and... racial words and things, up there, and it was, that was kind of an interesting experience. I guess, it is sort of a double-edged sword in geekdom. I see it, online as well. There's this idea, that, Japan has all of these cool ideas. They produce a lot of the stuff that, geeks grew up with. But then there also is this kind of stereotype idea that Japanese people are either a certain way and everybody behaves that way, or, just Japanese culture is just this bizarre place that nobody can understand.
Well, sometimes I have to say that the pop culture is very strange, and it is hard to understand.
Yeah.
I don't suppose you could explain tentacle porn to me by any chance.
I have no experience with that, and I don't really, I've never really had any desire to do any research on that, so yeah, I'm going to have to claim ignorance on that.
All right, I think that's a good thing to claim ignorance about. But, there are things like that you kind of look at, and you're like, this is a really strange kind of subculture here.
Yes, yeah. I wonder, if it has to do with the fact that a lot of the stuff that we get over here, it might not actually be representative of what's over there. I mean, I lived in Japan for 2 years, and we were sort of sequestered because we lived out in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't in one of the major cities, and so we weren't really plugged in. But I didn't see a lot of that really, the stuff that people usually talk about, the general weirdness about Japan. I didn't see a lot of it, and so I wonder if some of that has to do with the fact that just the stuff that comes over here is either going to be, aimed at sort of entertaining foreigners with, look at these, look at these silly Japanese people, or it's, the very specific sort of, and the explicit things that cater to a certain taste of people who are going to go out of their way to look for it. Mm-hmm. I think some of the kids in our school that I was teaching at, they were watching anime that had to do with kids who would get together in high school and form a track team or like play in a band, and some just very ordinary stuff, and it wasn't about the space tentacles, and it wasn't about these weird monsters and things. It was actually very standard ordinary stuff. So I don't know. I wonder if that has something to do with the way that we perceive it.
The range of anime is so huge.
Yeah.
Right? It goes all the way from sort of ordinary, the experiences of teenagers, to sci-fi, fantasy, weird stuff, all the way to actually dealing with very important and difficult topics.
Yeah.
I think one of them that I've watched is it called Tokyo Godfathers? Which is about homelessness in Tokyo. And
oh, wow.
These three old homeless men who discover a baby that's been abandoned or lost and try to find the mother. There's some really serious topics that are dealt with sometimes in anime.
Yeah, certainly. I have to confess that this is a blind spot for me, which is probably going to sound really strange to people. But part of it is just like you said, there's so much of it, and it's so broad, I don't even know where to start.
Yeah, I never quite got into anime very deeply, partly because of that. There are a few things that I have watched a lot of.
Yeah.
Cowboy Bebop, I went through that series. I've gone through the original Full Metal Alchemist series.
Yeah.
But, there's so much of it, and it's really hard to know where to start or what's worth watching.
Yeah.
I think Miyazaki is a pretty good safe place to start.
Oh yeah, and shortly after our conversation about his movies, I actually showed my son My Neighbor Totoro, and I was so proud. He sat there and he was transfixed by it for about the first 40 minutes. It's a pretty long movie, and it's asking quite a bit for a 2-year-old to sit there through the whole movie, but
that's pretty good, actually. That's really good.
He was just so fascinated by this. The little girl running around the Japanese countryside. He was like, "Oh, there's a little kid there. I like her," and he was just watching her, and I was really proud of him. That was the first part of the movie, and it wasn't sort of the second part where you get the cool monsters and things happening. But yeah, he just loved it, so I'm quite proud of him.
That's good. Well, as I told you, my first experience with anime, and I didn't realize that, was as a kid in West Berlin, watching on Sunday afternoon cartoons based on children's books, like Rascal or Heidi, that were translated into German.
Yeah,
and that's like early '80s anime.
Yeah, and
I didn't realize what that was until a lot later. My sister really loved the Heidi. Whenever the closing music came up, and she was perhaps about 3 or 4 at the time, she would start crying. It was really like a big part of our childhood. So, how does this connect with your faith then? Do you find a connection between your interests in video games or in anime with your faith as a Seventh Day Adventist?
Yeah, that's a good question, Ed. I've been thinking about that. On the surface, it was really hard to come up with, connection there. I guess, part of it is that Ellen White's writings, her most famous book, her most important book, at least to the church, is called The Great Controversy, and it was published in around the 1890s, I believe. And that book, it talks about, it's kind of starts out with this idea that there was a controversy or this disagreement in heaven between God and Satan, and that Satan decided that he was going to do things his own way. He started this rebellion in heaven and took a third of the angels with him, and now he's down here on earth and he's fighting with the forces of good and God, and he's trying to take down the church and the people in the church. And if you think about it, maybe this is sacrilege and I'm going to get kicked out of my community for this. But, that sounds sort of like science fiction to me.
I was thinking, that sounds like great anime, basically. Yeah.
Yeah, and actually there was a web series that was produced by the church. It's called The Record Keeper. And it's this sort of steampunk retelling of this story. And it's really interesting, but then, of course, the church being the church, they got sort of cold feet with the way that some of the presentations were going, and they pulled the plug on it after spending like $1 million on it.
Wow.
But it's really well done, and somebody, of course, went and uploaded the entire series to YouTube.
Uh-huh.
And so I might have access to that somewhere in my library. But anyway, yeah, there's this story, and it's this really kind of, cosmic narrative of good versus evil, of rebellion and tragedy, and all sorts of these great things, and I've been raised in this. This is sort of the big, huge meta-narrative that I've been raised on. And so, yeah, when I watch something like Star Wars, it's very easy for me to get into, the narrative, because a lot of these same ideas are there. But yeah, and also the idea, that geeks are sort of this smaller subculture. Maybe not so much now. I mean, everybody's a geek now. Everybody loves video games and anime and the like. But this idea that this is a thing that we have, and it's sort of our own thing. And Adventists are very sort of sectarian, and unfortunately kind of separated from the main group of Christians. And so that maybe that kind of mindset also. I have those things in common as well.
I one of the things that I have observed as I've been sort of thinking about and talking about these things and doing a theology and geek stuff podcast is that I think in a lot of ways geek culture and science fiction and fantasy is just the latest expression of some of these older stories.
Yeah.
I'm preaching through the book of Genesis this summer.
Oh, wow.
Of all the books in the Bible, that is probably the most mythical in the sense of these kinds of stories that it had. It's intended to be told as a story.
Yep.
It is written in that style.
Mm.
You were talking a little bit earlier about sort of the end times and the book of Revelation, a book that's very metaphorical and has lots of imagery in it, some very disturbing imagery. But that too, I think there's something in us that deeply connects with these kinds of stories, whether or not it's religion or it's Saturday morning cartoons.
Yeah, definitely. These images, cosmic battles, dragons, plagues from heaven, and these sorts of things. They tap into a very deep thing in human experience, and I think this sort of anxiety about the unknown. And is there something after death? Why are we suffering? Why do terrible things happen? And those stories about dragons and rebellion and cosmic warfare, they maybe help us to make sense of some of those things.
Yeah, I think so. I think so too. Now, when I was growing up, within Mennonites, there's always been this sort of suspicion of pop culture. Did the SDA have something similar when you were growing up? Were your parents worried about some of the things that you were watching?
Adventists very much have that experience. The last GeekCross that I listened to was the one with your cousin, I believe.
My cousin Jesse.
Jesse. Yes. Yeah, and when you were when the two of you were talking, I was thinking if you had edited out every reference to conservative Mennonites, I could have very easily stuck in Seventh Day Adventist in there. That was very much very similar to my experience growing up. Yeah, Adventists have always been suspicious of any kind of popular thing. The church, in fact, took a very hard stance against movies, going out to movie theaters. There were stories from 20, 30 years ago of school teachers going out to see the latest movie, but they'd go out to the town like 50 miles away to go to the theater so that nobody would see them. And of course then they just see all of the other Adventists over there, at this movie theater. But yeah, those sorts of things, TV, radio, popular music, movies, those are all viewed as kind of dangerous and probably things that very devout Adventists should not be consuming.
So do you not consider yourself to be a pious or a good Adventist?
I guess I would say that I'm not a standard Adventist. I'm probably not representative of, I guess, the mainstream. I would caution anybody who was listening to this and either thought, that my views sounded great or my views sounded terrible, don't judge all Adventists by what I'm saying, because I'm certainly not representative of like your average church member.
Mm-hmm. In what ways do you think you're different?
Well, I think in a lot of the lifestyle aspects, I'm actually quite conservative. I did mention that I eat meat, but that's coming to the point where it's not that big of a deal. A lot of Adventists refrain from even drinking coffee, and I don't. The church officially teaches that we should abstain from alcohol, and I do. I don't drink, but with coffee and alcohol, it's more a matter of I have tried both of those before, and I just don't like the taste. I can't get over the taste of those things. I don't see them as sort of moral failings or as moral issues. So maybe that's I guess in the way that I practice my lifestyle and I practice the religion, I can actually come across as fairly conservative. But in the way that I think about things and I process the beliefs and doctrines and why I do the things that I do, I probably fall on the very, very liberal spectrum of Adventist thought and belief.
I mean, I have to say I was a bit surprised when you and I started to get to know each other because I had never met a liberal Adventist before.
Yeah.
My experience with Adventists has been very conservative.
Yeah. Certainly where you live, that's probably standard. The West Coast is known as sort of the bastion of liberal Adventism. But when you get into, particularly in rural areas with the smaller churches, a lot of those churches and communities would be very conservative. So
in what ways are liberal Adventists different from their conservative brethren?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is reaction to the ways that we were brought up, thinking about the things that we were taught and saying, well, why do we do these things? Or why do we believe these things? One of the strange things about Adventism is that the denomination tends to be very conservative and, like I said, very sectarian and avoid contact with popular things and TV and music and movies. But yet they also have this very strong emphasis on education. I think the church operates one of the largest educational systems in the entire world. Ellen White wrote a lot of things about how important education was. And so a lot of Adventists growing up, we learn to think and we learn to examine things and be curious about the world because of this emphasis on education. And so a lot of people then start examining what we believe and why, and they start studying the Bible for themselves. And that sort of leads to this conflict with established church tradition and established doctrine and things. These liberal Adventists that I am thinking of, a lot of them have this. They place a high importance on social justice that the larger church doesn't. The larger church, it's preach the gospel, spread the message throughout the world, and whatever else happens, that's not important. And people around here, particularly at the university where I teach, it's very much emphasizing, we need to do something about poverty. We need to do something about racism. Those kinds of emphases are kind of unique to liberal Adventism. But, just also thinking about why do we do things? Why don't we eat meat? Why don't we wear jewelry? And a lot of people have come to reject the old reasons for doing those things. I don't know if that's a good or bad thing. A lot of historic Adventists would say that we're compromising our identity. We're compromising the, distinctive standards and the distinctive message of the church. But, a lot of us feel like we are trying to make this message relevant to the world we live in. We're trying to bring the gospel to people and minister to them where they are. And so, that's, I guess, where a lot of the tension comes from. From my perspective, it's a great thing. We should be changing and we should be adapting to the culture. But that's, I guess, me and my progressive bias. Whether we are losing something important, I know a lot of people do feel that way. I don't know what exactly the truth is, but I know my experience, and I think this is the most authentic, expression of my own religious experience here.
What areas do you find yourself most frustrated right now or in conflict with the SDA?
Well, we recently had our big general conference meeting. Again, it's a worldwide community of Adventists gathering together. And there they took a vote on a motion. It was a very specific motion. It said that should divisions, and division is the largest sort of organizational structure within the church, should individual divisions be able to make their own decisions whether or not to ordain women as full pastors, full leaders within the church. And this was a motion that was before the World Church, and the church voted it down. I think it's going to be disastrous for retaining members and evangelizing, particularly to young people. I think the church really needs to listen to additional voices. I think it is a survival thing, particularly for the church here in North America. We mentioned at the very beginning, there are 18 million Adventists. The church is growing by about 1 million people every year, but all of that is happening in South America and Africa, South Asia. The church here in North America, there's evidence that it's dying. We are losing at least 50% of the young people. And, decisions like just happened at the General Conference, they don't help. It makes the church look regressive and backwards and misogynistic, and those things, they won't play with the current generation coming up. I think the church needs to get serious about listening to people. Beyond the sort of survival issues, we need these voices to help us understand what the body of Christ is. We need these voices to take seriously our commission to spread the gospel. If the good gospel isn't good news for black people, if the gospel isn't good news for gay people or trans people, I'm not sure that we can call it the good news anymore. So much of Christianity and the message that I'm hearing to a lot of these groups is just negative. It's either wait for your rights or you shouldn't have any rights because you're going against the Bible. And something that just wounds me and it upsets me is that, at least just speaking for my community, so many times we're so sure that we are right because we have the Bible and we have the correct interpretation of it. And so what that means is we don't have to listen to anybody else because we already know that we're right and God has blessed us. And that deeply disturbs me. I just think of all of the ways, even in Adventist history, the ways that the church has had to sort of reverse course. What a lot of people don't know is that Adventist institutions were segregated back in the time of Jim Crow. There was a really terrible incident that happened where a black person died outside of one of our hospitals because we wouldn't serve them because they were black. The church has had to repent for that. We've had to apologize for that. The church has been forced to pay women equally for equal work. There was a case, it actually went to a court case in the early 80s, and the church lost. And, so we've been sort of dragged into reform, often by secular forces, and I'm just sitting here going, what are we doing? We say that we are the body of Christ, and who said, love one another as I have loved you. And I'm just sitting here going, how can we love people if we can't even listen to them? And so, I have this sort of burden. I want to encourage the church. I want to model to my community what it looks like simply to listen to people and to take their stories and their pain seriously. I don't know, the way that I experience the gospel, the way that I read the story is that God took our pain seriously, and he became a person. He became a human being with eyes and ears and feelings so that he could experience what we do. I would love for the church to simply take that seriously and to be the incarnate body once again.
A lot of what you're saying resonates with me because I have very similar frustrations in the Mennonite church. Right now, as we're dealing with, a church split, as we're dealing with people becoming more entrenched into their positions, I was reading something online today where somebody who I very much respect was saying because the Mennonite Church is not disciplining congregations and conferences that allow pastors who are gay and lesbian or have members or whatever, that this is not a church for biblical conservatives. That's an incredibly painful thing to read.
I'm really sorry.
Yeah, it's just the way things are right now. And we just have to kind of go through this and see what is left after all this repositioning is going on and move forward. Why, there are times I sort of wonder, why am I doing this?
Yeah.
And why do I stay? Why do you stay?
Oh, that's something that I've been processing over the last 3 weeks. I guess, to me, a lot of it has to do with simply the community. These are my people, and yes, they make me frustrated a lot, but yeah, this is the community that I grew up with, and I love this church for reasons that I don't always understand. But something that I keep in mind is, I don't understand why God would love us. I look at my life and, I don't understand why God would love me so much that, as the Bible says, he would send his son to live as a human and even suffer and die for me. And so that's something that I don't understand, and so maybe I stick around because I hope that God still loves this church with all of its faults and foibles, because that gives me hope that he could love me as well. The other thing is that I see in the beliefs of this church so much potential. The Sabbath is a major focus of Adventism, and it's become this sort of almost a joke in some circles, that we say, well, it's Saturdays, it's Sabbath, and so you can go to the pool, but don't swim. You just wade. You just, wade up to your ankles, and then you're okay, Or we're watching the sundown, and it's 3 minutes before sundown, and, if you turn on the television, that's terrible, but if you wait 3 minutes, then it's fine. Silly, trivial things. But the Sabbath as a symbol has so much potential. I read in the Bible that God created the world in 6 days. He created everything in 6 days, and he rested on the seventh. I read in Deuteronomy that God told the Israelites, "Remember the Sabbath because I brought you out of Egypt with a mighty arm, and when you were in Egypt you were slaves, and you didn't have any choice but to work. And now I've brought you out of there, and I am your master now, I am your ruler now, and what I am telling you that you have to do is you have to rest." And what would that mean, for a nation of slaves? That now their God tells them, what my will is for you is that you rest. That you take just a day, and you don't worry about work, and you just focus on family, you focus on, community. And there's so much potential in this symbol that I'd love to be a part of the conversation to reclaim this and to make it something that's bigger than just these silly legalistic rules. I don't know if that can happen. Maybe I'm just going to be this one voice out podcasting in the wilderness. I don't know.
We're in a culture that doesn't understand rest at all.
Yeah, there's this thing, I've read all sorts of articles recently, about Americans, they don't even take the vacation time that they have. We shortchange ourselves in that, and I just think, look, we have this idea that God tells us to rest, and, it's, the command is actually remember. The command isn't stop doing everything that you're doing, don't watch TV, don't listen to music. The command is to remember, and I think God is saying, remember what I created you to be. I didn't create you to be, to get your worth, your entire self-worth out of how big your paycheck is, or how fancy your house is. I created you because I love you, and because I love you, why don't you now go out and take that to other people? I freed you from slavery, whether it's slavery in bondage or slavery from sin. I freed you from this. Now, why don't you go on and take that message to other people and try to free them, make their lives better? All of these things could be the center of our worship, what we do on our Sabbath. And I feel like, that's a message that could actually be good news and could be transformational for people.
Okay, so Kevin, we were talking for a while here. Is there anything else you'd like to talk about?
I think I'm good. This has been an interesting conversation. I'm glad that I had the chance to speak with you about some of these things.
Where can people find you out on the internet?
Okay, let's see. I tweet very occasionally. I don't use Twitter a lot because the interface frustrates me. Condensing everything into that small space. I don't particularly like doing that. But my Twitter handle is _miniature. I realized that I should have made it something shorter, but that's what I've got. So it's lead, like the element lead, LEAD _miniature. Yeah, I can be reached there.
All right. Well, thanks, Kevin, for coming on.
All right. Well, thank you for having me, Jeremy. It's been really good talking to you.
If you like GeekCross, you can help us out by leaving us a review on iTunes. You can find our Twitter handle is @GeekCrossShow. You can email us at geekcrossshow@gmail.com. Show notes are going to be at jeremyyoder.net. This is a McLaren production. I'm Jeremy Yoder. Thanks for listening.